¿Qué tal, estimado público, estimados amigos que nos han estado acompañando en este Congreso Facts de nuestra versión 2022? Muchas gracias porque hasta este momento se han quedado con nosotros y el hecho de que hayan permanecido tiene su premio, porque ahora vamos a tener una de las más importantes entrevistas de este evento con una persona muy influyente que se ha convertido en un referente de la apologética y del pensamiento cristiano en estos años, no solamente para personas ya más grandes y estudiadas, que tienen ya mucha experiencia en el campo, sino también para los jóvenes, para los adolescentes. Es un intelectual que no solamente sabe relacionarse con los más grandes intelectuales, sino que también puede él pasar los principios de la vida cristiana, de nuestra cosmovisión teísta, y que lo sabe explicar a las generaciones que apenas se están preparando en la vida, porque él conoce la importancia de conectar todas las generaciones que se encuentran presentes y que son funcionales en este tiempo. Nada más y nada menos, estamos hablando de el estimado Sean McDowell. Seguramente ustedes van a reconocer ese apellido, McDowell, precisamente también por la historia que se ha hecho su padre, Josh McDowell. Pero si ustedes dan un paseo por las obras de Sean, se van a dar cuenta de que es un autor prolífico. Puede él hablar acerca de todos estos temas contemporáneos como homosexualismo, como aborto, como los temas culturales relevantes de hoy en día, pero también él puede adentrarse en las profundidades de algunos temas como el destino de los apóstoles, cómo fue que murieron los apóstoles. De hecho, esa fue su disertación doctoral. Cómo fue que los apóstoles murieron y cómo eso confirma la evidencia de la resurrección de Jesús cuando sus seguidores más cercanos creyeron de verdad que él murió y que resucitó y dieron su vida por eso. También ha escrito acerca de ciencia, acerca de temas de apologética, también cultural o histórica. En definitiva, les invitamos a que ustedes busquen en Amazon o en cualquier otro sitio donde puedan comprar libros, sus obras, para que tengan acceso a todo el conocimiento que Dios le ha permitido adquirir. Entonces, la entrevista que vamos a estar llevando a cabo en este momento se titula Apologética para una nueva generación. Específicamente, cómo vamos a enfocar los principios apologéticos para la especialmente llamada generación Z. Me imagino que si tú eres padre de familia, si eres hermano mayor, si eres profesor en alguna escuela secundaria o preparatoria, te darás cuenta que la generación Z representa grandes retos, representa también grandes oportunidades. ¿Y cuál es el impacto que ellos pueden tener en los futuros años? Esto se viene muy de la mano sobre cómo les vamos a presentar a ellos el mensaje de Cristo, pero sobre todo los principios apologéticos para que ellos puedan resolver sus dudas, porque después van a tomar las riendas de nuestras empresas, instituciones educativas, de nuestros colegios, de nuestros sistemas de gobierno y todos los demás. Así que agárrense de sus asientos porque vamos a tener una serie de preguntas muy candentes, muy interesantes, todo desde el punto de vista de Sean McDowell. Así que vamos en este momento a presentar a los que los vamos a entrevistar. Se encuentra con nosotros Raúl Jaramillo, ya lo conocen, director regional de capítulos de Fe Razonable en Latinoamérica. Hola Raúl, ¿cómo estás?
¿Qué tal, David? Un gusto estar aquí con ustedes. Muchas gracias.
Ok, bueno, pues ya lo tenemos. También un servidor, David Domínguez, del Ministerio Redefensa, va a estar también entrevistando unas cuantas preguntas a nuestro estimado amigo Sean McDowell. Hello, Sean, how are you? It's nice to have you here in this FACTS event.
Fantástico, mucho gusto conocerte.
Ok, el gusto es de nosotros. We are pleased too, very, very pleased. Así que, estimado público, vamos ahora a pasar del español al inglés. Agradecemos su comprensión.
Sean, you're a very prolific author and we've learned so much about you, but because you've written on a lot of topics, especially the one that we're going to touch today on Gen Z and Christianity, historic Christianity, Christianity and science. But for the audience that might not know your work, what can you tell us about your trajectory in the field of apologetics? What can you share about your projects, your insights, what you like, what you don't like?
Sure. So I teach full-time at Talbot School of Theology, which is at Biola University. And I teach classes on the resurrection, classes why God allows evil, teach classes on just kind of evangelism, spiritual conversations, and social issues. That's my full-time job. I teach one high school class part-time, a Bible class, because I love the next generation, like you said, Gen Z. And then I just get to speak, write, do a lot of stuff on social media and YouTube as well. I'm really a communicator. So I'm a generalist. There's some people who focus just on particular issues. But like you said, I've taught on the historical Jesus, written on that, written on science and faith, a book on understanding intelligent design. I have a book coming out soon called A Rebel's Manifesto on social issues for students, and cover quite a range on my YouTube channel. So I'm a generalist with a heart for the next generation.
Yeah, that's a great way to describe like an overview of everything that you've done, and we hope that soon can get more material in Spanish. So like, because I've watched many of your interviews, they're so good. There's a particular one that I liked really much, which was with the one that you interviewed this guy that had a YouTuber that was an atheist, but it was more to get to know him. I can't remember the YouTuber. Do you remember him?
I think you're referring to Coleman Hughes, kind of the young thinker who talks about political issues. He has a podcast YouTube channel called Conversations with Coleman. Just a smart, thoughtful guy who engages in civil conversation. And I reached out to him and said, can I ask you some questions on race? Because that's just a very important topic right now in my context, and his beliefs in God. And he came on and let me ask him kind of some of the big questions about life. It was fun. I hope we have a follow-up soon.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, any interview that you have, it's really great and has good material. But the subject that we're going to touch today, as David mentioned, was Gen Z, and I'll let him go ahead and ask the next question.
Yeah. Personally, I want to remark one of your conferences before I give my question. You gave about, for example, pornography and those topics. So those from you are also remarkable. So for that, we are very honored to have you in this interview. So you mentioned the Gen Z. So it is obvious that you are passionate about that generation because you work with them. So we are going to talk more profoundly about those kind of guys. So what exactly is Gen Z? How did you get so interested in the topic of Generation Z?
So demographers will differ on exactly when they say Gen Z begin and ends. But essentially, you might say Gen Zers are like upper elementary school, so probably 10 or 11 years old, up to those maybe mid-20s that are out of college entering the workforce. That's typically who's meant by Gen Z. And I think I'm interested in Gen Z because since I started teaching, writing, speaking, I've always had a heart for the next generation. So whatever generation comes after Gen Z and our elementary and junior high school students, I'll be interested in passing on the faith to that generation. So I think this is the generation that's truly a digital generation. We can get into some of the factors about this generation, but they're really those like 10 to 25 years old that have been deeply shaped by a lot of secular ideas. And those of us who are parents and teachers and mentors and leaders need to be very intentional about passing on the faith and evangelizing this generation.
And could you give, let's see, could you give 4 more characteristics of this generation in order to have a broader picture of this kind of persons, please?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Gen Z is really the first generation that I would speak around the world about, because for previous generations, people would ask me to speak and I'd think, how can I go to your culture and your context and say anything meaningful about young people? But I've spoken on this in New Zealand, in I think the Philippines and Singapore, have a chance to speak with you here for those in Latin America. It's part of Gen Z. It's really one of the first truly global generations. And this is because of TikTok. It's because of YouTube. It's because of things like Netflix, that there are global trends that we see now in many ways that we haven't seen with previous generations. And I think the biggest defining characteristic of this generation is that they're digital natives, is that the vast majority of people in Gen Z have been raised swiping smartphones and tablets before many of them could speak or read. They have no memory of a world where they're not connected to who they want, what they want, when they want it, how they want it. I have a memory, for example, of getting lost as a kid. They have no memory of that because their smartphones, they're constantly in touch with other people and constantly distracted. An endless influx of information is the heart of this generation. One other interesting thing we've seen, especially with COVID, is that there's certain mental health issues for this generation. This is not just in America. Issues of suicidality, depression, anxiety. And there's a lot of debates about how much of this is brought on by technology, brought on by the COVID pandemic. But that seems to be more of a trend we are seeing among Gen Z that concerns a lot of people. There's also a deep secular influence with this generation. Again, this is not just America. We're seeing this worldwide because people have smartphones, and I've been on TikTok, and there's people pushing all kinds of worldviews on TikTok all over social media, certainly in different educational systems. There are a lot of secular ideas reaching this generation in ways we had not seen as much globally as we have before.
The moment you mentioned that this was the first global generation, I immediately thought about all the TV shows, the Marvel movies, because we all can connect with this content that has been created specifically for this kind of generation, and we've all seen it. It's very difficult right now to find somebody that hasn't watched the Avengers or any of the new Marvel series or something like that. Now, Sean, the course that I took, I think 2 years ago on Gen Z, you mentioned that sometimes we can have the wrong ideas about a generation, and we can have labels for generations that sometimes shape the way that we talk to them, that we relate to them, and that we see them overall. What are the many people of my generation, I consider myself a millennial, but millennials and Gen X, they usually see Gen Zs with very negative labels. They picture them as entitled or lazy or stuff like that. What can you say about this kind of way of labeling a generation? And what case can you make for us to change the way we see Gen Z?
Well, thanks for taking that class with me and remembering, because this is a very important point. What I've done to educators, to parents, pastors, is before I get into what's unique about this generation, I'll say, hey, throw out words that you think describe this generation. And words we often hear are entitled, close-minded, shallow, babied, snowflake. These are some of the most common words. And then I'll ask people, I'll say, okay, before I talk about some trends of this generation, I want you to think about the words that came to your mind. Are they positive or are they negative? And I'm telling you, the vast majority are negative. And I say, because you know what? How you view this generation is going to shape how you relate to them. Every single generation since Adam and Eve, there's been positives and there's been negatives. And the older we get, the easier it is to adopt the mantra, hey kid, get off my lawn. Things are not the way they used to be in the 70s, 80s, 90s, etc. That's just human nature. What happens is when we see this generation through a negative lens, this is such a generation that values authenticity, they're going to pick up on it. And know that you don't really consider it a privilege to minister to them and don't deeply care about them. So I'm not saying avoid the negative things. There are concerns I have about this generation, but there is incredible promise and potential in this generation, as there is with every other generation as well. So let's make sure we approach them that it's a privilege and see the positive, and then we'll relate to them, I think, more effectively.
Yeah, indeed. Now, there was another point that you also made on that course, and I really like that, and I would like to expand. Well, I'd like you to expand a little bit more on that idea. You mentioned that given a lack of religious involvement of their parents, and that is the millennials generation, Gen Zs are most likely to have a blank slate when it comes to Christianity. Can you elaborate on this idea? What do you mean? What are the statistics, maybe, if you have those at hand? And share with us what your thoughts on it.
So this is a study on Gen Z that's put out by Barna. So this was in North America. This was not in Latin America. This was not in Europe. This specific fact was in North America. Now, I suspect there's a lot of truth of it internationally for different reasons, but I don't want to speak out of what this study shows. There were 2 studies on Gen Z done by Barna in partnership with Impact 360. And what they said is millennials, your generation, Juan, has, even those who don't believe in God, a lot of them went to church and have a religious background and some negative baggage from religion. Many in Gen Z don't have that background. There's more with a secular background and less negative views of the church as with previous generations. So in some way, that means there's less biblical literacy, but also arguably less baggage that there has been before. So it's more like a blank slate. Now, I say that with caution because if many people are watching this in Latin America, I don't know your particular context and the influence of religion in your city and in your church. So take that as far as it goes. But I definitely would say with social media, secular ideas have more of an avenue to this generation than any generation before. And they've been deeply affected by secular ideas. I think we know that with confidence.
Before giving David, the next question, even if it's only in the United States, what can the church do, or maybe what have you done to take maybe advantage of that blank slate that many people in Gen Z seem to display?
Well, it really reminds me that biblical literacy is at a low, and there's just not an understanding of a lot of simple things that we could take for granted in the past, whether it's biblical ideas, biblical stories. And I also don't want to approach this generation assuming that they have overly negative views of the church, which was often the case with previous generations. So I think presenting the gospel message, building relationships with this generation, inviting them to Christian events and to be in relationship with Christians is just something really positive that we can do with this generation. I think there's an inquisitiveness amongst many young people that just don't feel like they have all their questions answered in the way that previous generations did. So to me, it's just a reminder that it's an opportunity, that here's a generation that needs to know, and I want to jump out there and help them understand a Christian way of seeing the world.
Sean, before I go to the next question, I would like to make a bit of follow-up of something you said about secularism. Could we make a case of a correlation between the high levels of secularism in churches and schools with the ubiquitous problems of depression, anxiety, and these mental health issues that teenagers are experiencing of all over the world? What is your opinion about that? Could we make a case about that?
I think we could. How far of a case, I'm not certain. I would have to look at the numbers. But I actually have a book coming out in July called A Rebel's Manifesto, and there's a chapter on suicide that's in there. And one of the fellows I interviewed from Stand to Reason, his name is John Nuevas, and he makes a strong connection between how worldview shapes the way somebody's going to approach taking their life or not in some circumstances. I mean, if the atheist secular worldview is true, there is no intrinsic human value. There's no life after death. There's no God who's going to judge you. There's no objective right and wrong. That's very different than saying a Christian worldview, every life has value. God is with you and forgives you and promises hope. So he makes a distinction and says when we approach issues like suicide, it's very important that we deal with, there can be biochemical issues with somebody, there can be mental illness, but we cannot separate the worldview components from how somebody faces suffering. Now, that's not to say, obviously every atheist is not going to commit suicide, and we have some Christians who do. That's why I don't want to read too much into it. But it's absolutely true that on every single mental health issue, there's a secular way of approaching it. There's a Christian way of approaching it. And if Christianity is really true, then we're going to find when we approach things Christianly, we're putting people in touch with reality and are able to better help people when they're hurting.
So, we are talking about these issues that teenagers suffer. So it could be sure to say that they have doubts. So, Sean, what would be the most important and incisive doubts that people from Generation Z have these days?
Well, I think studies show that there's a few primary kinds of questions that Gen Zers have. And I'll tell you what's really interesting about this, David, is a lot of the questions that believers and non-believers have are very, very similar, which is interesting. So some of the data on Gen Z would say there's big questions related to the problem of evil. Some of the top 10 questions, I think at least 3 or 4 of them are related to the problem of evil, whether it's suffering, whether it's hypocrisy, the bad things done by people who call themselves Christians. Evil and suffering always has been and always will be one of the top questions that people are dealing with. Another big question of doubts is the intersection of science and faith, whether that's on questions of evolution, questions of the vaccines, questions of the age of the earth. For many people, they think if they're going to follow God, they have to give up their views of science. And given how much science has contributed to the world, that feels like a big pill to swallow for a lot of people. Other questions that we find are related not so much to the truth of Christianity, but the goodness of Christianity. So questions like hell, again, questions like the problem of evil, and even questions related to LGBTQ relationships. The larger narrative is that a biblical sexuality is harming people. And that's questions that a lot of Gen Zers have. How do they reconcile scriptural teaching with what they're hearing from their friends and what they're seeing in the larger world in which they live? So in sum, I think it's questions about God's goodness, problem of evil, science and faith, and questions of sexuality are the most common ones that I'm getting from Christians and non-Christians.
It's very interesting that you say that these come from Christians and non-Christians. And before we go to the next question, something that you mentioned also is really important, the way that we relate to Gen Zs. And also touching upon one aspect that you mentioned at the beginning was authenticity. I've come to learn that the best way to relate to Gen Zers is being there for them, try to listen to them, understanding them before I try to approach with a gospel or with a message or with an idea, because relationship is fundamental. And something that got stuck in my brain since I've been following your work was that Jesus came in grace and truth, and those two need to be together every time we approach not only Gen Z but everybody. Although, because if we only come in truth, it can be they won't take it immediately. They won't be convinced. They need to trust you first before you can share the gospel message with them,
Yeah.
or any message you want to share. Now, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, one thing I would say is I think you're right with Gen Zers. And I don't know that that's unique just to Gen Z. I think that's a timeless truth about all people, and in particular young people. Now, there are some people that are more perceptive because of where, or more open because of where they're at in life to hearing truth. Others, you need to build relationship and really slowly break in to earn a right to be heard. The wise person is able to assess where somebody is at. But we make a mistake when it's just relationships. We never speak truth. And we make a mistake when we just hammer truth and it's not done in love. So that balance you're talking about, grace and truth, is exactly biblical and right.
Now, touching again upon the subject of relationships, the subject of biblical sexuality is also a very sensitive topic among Christians and non-Christians. And this is because, not only because the media has tried to push this agenda. I remember that when I was in college a few years ago, any TV show I watched on any streaming platform always had a person, a homosexual person, a gay person, and right now it's the same thing. But also, not only the media, many people are coming out, are feeling more comfortable coming out to their parents, to their families, and this has brought young people to ask questions. Okay, I believe in Christianity, but how do I make sense of hating my brother, my sister, my best friend? I don't want to reject them, so I prefer to reject Christianity rather than put some distance between my friends, my families. Is that right? What are your thoughts on that?
I think that's exactly right. This is important, especially for people probably 35 and 40 up, is that when I was growing up in the 90s, the issue of homosexuality felt like it was an issue that was out there. It wasn't in your face. There wasn't as many classmates and clubs in schools. Even in some of the film, it was just a character here and there. But now it's everywhere for this generation. It's not just an issue in the culture. It's their friends. It's people they see on TikTok. So when we approach this, we have to have such a sensitivity that we're not just talking about a topic and a biblical idea. These are human beings. This is a generation that needs to learn, how do we think Christianly about this? And then how do I live this out with being, a hateful bigot to my friends who are gay? That is a personal dilemma for many in this generation in a way it wasn't for their parents or grandparents.
Indeed. And it's going to take well, what are your thoughts on that? Is it going to take a while for the church to learn this? Because, for example, in my own church here, we don't know how to deal. Right now, the issue has migrated from the gay community to the transgender community. That's a different topic. And I don't want to sidetrack this, but what are your thoughts on how the church will need, or what does the church need to learn to approach these issues?
Well, one is we got to teach really good theology within the church, not just what we're against, but what we're for. Kids know in some cases what the Bible says, but they don't know why marriage is between a man and a woman. They don't understand what it means to be human and why your gender identity should match up with your bodily sex, scripturally speaking. So number one, there's a lot of confusion and the culture seeping into the church because we haven't taught really good theology. But second, we also have to teach people how to practically love those who see the world differently. And we don't. Sometimes this has been a culture war issue, and we haven't loved our neighbors as well as we can. And young people pick up on that. So there's a lot of difficult questions, what it looks like. People ask me questions all the time. Should I go to a same-sex wedding? Should I use a preferred pronoun? And some churches are afraid to even talk about these issues. And I'm sitting here going, if we don't talk about these issues, we are failing to equip people with some of the toughest issues they're practically dealing with in their daily lives. So let's talk about it. Let's reach out and care for those in our community. And let's teach good theology and worldview as well.
Sean, it's very interesting what you mentioned about the relationship between Gen Zs and the technology. You say that Koreans and Europeans, Americans, Mexicans, people from Chile, every Gen Z in the world speaks the same language because it's the same technology and the same apps, TikTok, Facebook, Netflix, and so on. So we need to talk about technology more profoundly. And we know that this part is a core part of Generation Z. They learn in the way in which they learn life. So technology could be a powerful tool to enhance their skills and also be a dangerous trap to destroy their lives. What could be a balanced strategy to strengthen the study of apologetics and theology using technology, but also taking care that technology does not confuse them about what is real and what is virtual? What are your thoughts about that?
Responses. Number one, we need to have good boundaries when it comes to technology. In my classroom, I don't have students on technology in terms of digital technology. I want to see them face to face and give them a break from staring at a screen. In my home, we have some boundaries with technology about where technology is, when we use it, when we see things face to face. My two kids were two of the last when they were, I think they were both about 14 when they finally got a smartphone in a Christian school. Almost all their friends had had it for 2 years, and we just resisted. Same with social media. So we need to have thoughtful boundaries and not just play by the script of our culture, but ask, are our kids ready? Have we given them appropriate boundaries? And the second thing is just to teach young people how to use technology well. So I teach kids how to analyze film from a Christian perspective. I teach kids, even my own kids, we have a lot of conversations about how does our smartphone affect us? How does it shape the way we see ourselves? How does it shape the way we treat other people? There's a theology of technology that we need to do a good job talking about. So number one, have the right boundaries. And number two, just teach all people, including young people, how to have how to use technology well and think Christianly about it. I'm not sure we do either of those really, really well right now.
I love the way that you frame it, theology for technology. That's a really cool.
Mm-hmm.
Now, going into the next question, you mentioned that you've taught your students and your own children and to analyze movies, analyze TV shows, and I've seen you analyze Avengers, Stranger Things, and stuff like that. I really enjoy that. Do you think that is I don't want to say appropriate, like a better way or a good way to share with Gen Zs the truth of the gospel without seeming like overwhelmingly preachy, or like you're in a Bible Sunday school, stuff, using the stories that popular culture thrusted upon us?
Yeah, it's a great question. I do, and I don't even know that it's unique to Gen Z. I like that. When I was a high school student growing up, it works in the classroom with those who are Christians. If I start talking about, what's a biblical view of vengeance, students will be moderately interested. If I start talking about the recent Batman film and how Batman is motivated towards vengeance, and is that a biblical view of vengeance or non-biblical view, then all of a sudden they're interested in the conversation. So just from a teaching perspective, as long as we use wisdom and discernment and care in how we use movies, of course, it's a great teaching strategy. But also with kids who are not even Christians, there's so many questions of like, why do we love superhero movies? Well, we want the idea that somebody's going to fight for justice and the good guys are going to win. Why do we want that so deeply? What does that tell us about what it means to be human? That we need and want a savior so deeply tied to sin in the world. And what does it tell us that in the Marvel movies that they climaxed with Iron Man willingly laying down his life as the 1 in 14 million possibilities to actually save half the universe? Doesn't that sound like what Jesus did? These kinds of questions, I think, are just great ways to engage Christians and non-Christians in spiritual conversation.
Yeah, that one and the analogy of Harry Potter also was a really good analogy. I liked it a lot. And yeah, it's really interesting how the narrative that many popular movies and books and songs and TV shows share this kind of Christian message in the background. I know David had a follow up on this, so I'll let him go ahead.
Yeah, well, maybe not about this topic in superhero movies and this very interesting that we should have maybe later shown a talk about this, about the image of the true hero and how the heroism in this modern time is shaped by what Christ did and is in the Bible. Is written and is told in the Bible, so it could be a very interesting topic, but with hours of speaking,
Sure,
we could agree with that. But I was thinking about the what you said about that you prohibit technology in your classes with your students. So the follow up was that, would you advise young parents, people maybe from my age, in the 30s and maybe 20s, they don't know what to do about the young children, maybe 2-3 years old? Should they give them access to technology in those very early ages, or should they wait to present them with technology in 2, 3, 4 years old?
So I'm not a child psychologist. I don't know exactly the effect on, but in general, I don't have a problem with some technology for some time in some places. So I don't mind if a kid is on a smartphone now and then watching a movie. That doesn't bother me. What starts to bother me is when kids have a smartphone all the time and parents start using it and start teaching kids that there's no downtime, can't entertain themselves, and just so you don't whine, I'll give you a smartphone to entertain you. That, to me, those are very destructive, unwise habits. So maybe there's some psychologists who say you should never let a kid look at a film and don't have any technology. They could make that case. I'm up to it for some cases with moderation and with wisdom. It's okay. Bottom line is, regardless of the age, I'm talking about college students. I don't want smartphones out. I don't want tablets. I don't want computers. Now, I let my graduate students do it because they're at a different place in life and they want to type their notes. But college students in high school, no smartphones out, no technology. This is a technology-free space. I want to see their eyes and have a conversation with them. So the bottom line is we just have to be wise and thoughtful about technology. And we tend to give in because it's easier to just give in than it is to fight the battles. And I have certainly done that many times. But my wife and I try really hard to say what's best for our kids. Are we having good boundaries? When it comes to technology, that's how we should approach it.
It's really great to have you here with us today. As we approach to the end of this interview, which it has been really good, two last questions. The first one, for any person that is watching here that is a Gen Zer or maybe a young millennial, what 3 advices would you give them?
Well, let me just say, if you're a Gen Zer, so just you're a young person, whatever label that we would use, make sure you have older Christians in your life speaking into you. So whether it's parents, grandparents, a coach, a teacher, a mentor, seek out people who are older and have them speak into your life. I have people like that still that are 15, 20 years older than I am that speak invited and sometimes uninvited into my life because they care about me and they see an area they need to speak truth to me. Sometimes in our generation, it just praises the younger and the newer, the better. But biblically, there's a lot of wisdom in those who are older. So make sure that you reach out with and just suck up the wisdom and experience of generations that have come before. That would be my big encouragement to you.
And what would your advice be for youth pastors or teachers that deal constantly with young people? How to approach them, relate to them? Maybe something that wasn't touched upon this interview, something that you can add?
Sure. I would say when it comes to this generation, I want to try to equip them to go out and do the ministry and work themselves. So rather than just top down, here's the information, record it. That's an older way of approaching things. And there's a time and place for that. I want to equip this generation and get them out serving the poor, engaging their neighbors, having spiritual conversations. So how can you teach this generation, but get them out of just the classroom, finding ways to practice and live out their faith? That's when it really becomes real. So whether it's defending the faith, whether it's serving the poor, get them out doing it. And then I think you'll see a lot of the life change that comes alongside it.
Dear brother Sean, I hate to tell this, but we are approaching to the closing time of this interview, but we don't want to, but it's nature, it's the cycle of nature. So something that has a beginning, it has an end. So we hope to have you in next interviews with reasonable faith with us in Latin America. But we are very blessed to have you. We are very blessed that we had you in this interview, and we hope that God blesses you in the next interviews, videos, conferences, and books you are going to write, Sean. It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure.
Thank you for having me. Great questions, and just encouraged what you're doing.
All right, Raul, do you have final words to Sean before we go to the audience?
Just to thank you, Sean, and maybe recommend to the audience, maybe those who can't speak and read English. This is one of your books, Apologetics for a New Generation. I think it's a really good book. A lot of topics that we covered today, you can find more in-depth reflection on those. Sean, again, your work, your interviews, your YouTube channel, your blog is an amazing blessing for everybody. Hopefully, it is my prayer, to be completely honest with you, that we can have some of those translated in Spanish. I know they're going to be a great blessing for everybody.
Brother Dave and Brother Raul, thank you.
Thanks to you. Y también le agradecemos al estimado público que nos estuvo escuchando en esta entrevista. Esperamos que hayan podido interiorizar excelentes principios, ya sea que sean pastores, que sean padres de familia, que sean profesores en preparatorias, en secundarias o, por qué no, hasta en universidades, que hayan podido adquirir un panorama todavía mayor, que su visión se haya podido expandir en este tema de la generación Z. Y si ustedes son miembros de la generación Z, que este panorama les haya servido para que ustedes puedan conjuntar las dudas que tienen, la presión que el mundo ejerce sobre ustedes, pero cómo todo lo pueden enfocar a la luz de la cosmovisión cristiana, que es relevante para todas las generaciones. Les invitamos a que continúen con nosotros en las siguientes conferencias y entrevistas de su evento Facts 2022. Que tengan un excelente día. Hasta luego.